It's a real great pleasure to be here in Great Falls to commemorate Tim's service on the Board of Directors of the Helena branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. From what Tim has described, people can get a good sense of the contributions that our directors make to the Federal Reserve System. However, as the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, I would just stress the value of this citizen participation in our nation's central bank. It is important for people to realize that the Federal Reserve is represented and served by dedicated citizens like Tim from places like Great Falls, Helena, Billings, and from many towns like them all across the country. The time that Tim has contributed to the Federal Reserve is truly public service. So thank you, Tim, for your commitment and dedication, and thanks also to the other members of the Helena Branch Board of Directors, all of whom are here today, as well as the former directors who are with us. So I plan to talk for about half an hour, and then I look forward to your questions and comments. And I always find that part of the talk, frankly, is most interesting for me, because those are great learning opportunities. But before we proceed any further, I do need to remind you that the following views are my own, and not necessarily those of others in the Federal Reserve. So in my remarks today, I'm going to begin by describing the objectives of the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC, which is the monetary policy making arm of the Federal Reserve System. With that as background, I will then turn to a discussion of monetary policy. My jumping off point is a phrase in the FOMC statement that was issued on September 13th. In that statement, the committee said that it, quote, expects that a highly accommodative stance of monetary policy will remain appropriate for a considerable time after the economic recovery strengthens. My main message today is that the FOMC can provide additional monetary stimulus by making this sentence more precise in the form of what I'm going to call a liftoff plan. So let me So what I'm going to call a liftoff plan. What a liftoff plan is going to be is a description of the economic conditions that would lead the committee to contemplate the initial increase in the Fed funds rate above its current extraordinarily low level. So I'm going to suggest the following specific contingency plan for liftoff. So as long as the FOMC satisfies its price stability mandate, it should keep the Fed funds rate extraordinarily low until the unemployment rate has fallen below 5.5%. So what the Fed funds rate here is a short-term interbank lending rate that is the FOMC's usual vehicle for influencing overall credit conditions. Now, I'm going to be much more precise later in the talk about what I mean by satisfies its price stability mandate. Briefly, though, I mean that longer-term inflation expectations are stable, and that the committee's medium-term outlook for the annual inflation rate is within a 1/4 percentage point of its target of 2%. So the substance of this plan is that as long as longer-term expectations, inflation expectations remain stable, the committee will not raise the Fed funds rate unless the medium-term outlook for the inflation rate exceeds a threshold of 2.25%, or the unemployment rate falls below a threshold of 5.5%. And it's going to be really important. These are going to be thresholds and not triggers. That's once the relevant liftoffs are crossed, the committee is going to retain the option of either keeping the Fed funds rate extraordinarily low or raising the Fed funds rate. So the goal here of my proposed liftoff plan is to contain a specific definition of the phrase, a considerable time after the economic recovery strengthens. And in my talk, what I'm going to argue is that this specificity about an event that may not take place for 4 or more years will provide needed current stimulus to the economy. So let me begin by describing the monetary policy objectives of the FOMC. Congress has specified in the Federal Reserve Act that the FOMC should make monetary policy so as to promote price stability and to promote maximum employment. These two objectives, price stability and maximum employment, are typically termed the dual mandate. In January, the FOMC issued an important consensus statement of long-run principles and strategies. And this statement provides a specific definition of price stability as representing a goal over the longer run of 2% inflation. But there are a couple of reasons why this definition of price stability is not as operational as one might like. So one issue is that monetary policy influences inflation with lags. So policymakers are generally thinking about making current choices so as to influence the annual inflation rate in about 2 years' time. Thus, monetary policy choices made toward the end of 2012 should be evaluated in terms of their impact on the annual inflation rate in the calendar year 2014. As a result, policymakers' choices are shaped by what I'm going to call the medium-term outlook for the inflation rate. That is the forecast for the annual inflation rate in 2 years. Now, there's a second operational issue. In some circumstances, it may be appropriate to follow policies that may lead the medium-term outlook for inflation to deviate from the long-run target of 2%. Indeed, most central banks, including ones that don't have an employment mandate like the Fed does, find that this kind of flexibility is desirable. Now, the tension here is the public may cease to regard 2% as a meaningful long-run target if it sees too much of a gap between 2% and the committee's medium-term outlook for inflation. So a key question is, how much leeway around 2% is appropriate? And the committee has made no formal decision about this issue, and my own thinking continues to evolve. But I currently believe that allowing the medium-term outlook for inflation to deviate from 2% by 1/4 percentage point in either direction would provide sufficient flexibility to the committee while posing no threat to the credibility of the long-run target. So my thinking on this is informed by the following chart. This is a chart that goes back to 1997, and what it represents is the medium-term inflation outlook based on material prepared for FOMC meetings over the past 15 years. So the green part is what comes from the so-called Green Book, which is staff forecasts prepared for the committee. And then the blue lines refer to the summary of economic projections, which are projections offered by the FOMC participants themselves. The thing you want to take away from here, this is the outlook at the meeting at the end of the year for what inflation is going to be in 2 years' time, and it never went above 2.25%, even though unemployment at times during this period was below 5%. Okay? So the basic point here is that the medium-term inflation outlook has not risen above 2.25% over the past 15 years. Now, to sum up what I've been saying so far, the FOMC defines its price stability mandate as a 2% inflation target over the longer run. When making this definition operational, it is necessary to take into account the lags associated with monetary policy and to allow for some medium-term flexibility around the long-run target. Given these considerations, in my view, the FOMC can be said to be satisfying its price stability mandate as long as its medium-term outlook for inflation is between 1.75% and 2.25%, and as long as longer-term inflation expectations remain stable. Now, in formulating my preferred operational definition of price stability, I've made reference to a committee medium-term outlook for inflation. Now, what I have in mind here is not my own outlook or some average of FOMC participants' individual outlooks. So I actually don't have in mind this, what I have plotted here, this picture, which is staff forecasts and a summary of individual participants' forecasts for inflation. What I have in mind is a collective outlook for inflation that has been determined by the committee as a whole. And the committee currently does formulate such an outlook, and it communicates that outlook through its statement. However, these communications are typically purely qualitative. My proposed operational definition of price stability hinges on the committee's formulating and communicating a quantitative collective outlook. Regardless of what one thinks of the Liftoff plan that I will elaborate on shortly, monetary policy would be clearer and more accountable if the committee followed the practice of other central banks and reported this kind of quantitative collective outlook, medium-term outlook for inflation, at least quarterly. Now, so far I've been focusing on the FOMC's price stability mandate, but I noted earlier the FOMC has a second mandate, which is to promote max employment. Whenever an organization has two goals, it is logically possible that it would face a tension between these two goals. But recent macroeconomic data and public communications from the FOMC's September 13th meeting reveal that there is no such tension at this time. The unemployment rate is elevated above a level that the committee sees as consistent with its employment mandate. Most FOMC participants' medium-term inflation outlooks are at 2% or below. These observations imply that by increasing monetary accommodation, the committee can better meet its employment mandate while still satisfying its price stability mandate. And this current lack of tension is the committee's public communications suggest that this current lack of tension between the two mandates is likely to continue for some time. Most FOMC participants currently project that in the long run, an unemployment rate less than 6% is consistent with 2% inflation. These forecasts suggest that violations of price stability are unlikely to occur until the unemployment rate is considerably lower than its current level of 7.8%. So I now turn to the main focus of my talk, which is the development of a Liftoff plan, an economic contingency plan for the initial increase in the Fed funds rate. I've described how the FOMC currently sees little tension between its two mandates and how its public communications suggest that this lack of tension between the mandates seems likely to continue. The current and future lack of tension between the two mandates will be a critical foundation for the plan that I'm going to describe. Let me start with some background. The FOMC has two types of accommodation in place right now. First, it is targeting the federal funds rate between 0 and 0.25%. The committee expects to keep that interest rate extraordinarily low at least through mid-2015. Second, the FOMC has bought a large amount of long-term government-issued and government-backed assets. Indeed, in September, the committee announced its intention to expand its holdings of these assets over the coming months. Both of these forms of accommodation are designed to put downward pressure on interest rates. This downward pressure on interest rates is intended to discourage firms and households from saving or buying financial assets, instead encourage them to spend. When firms and households spend, their extra demand for goods and services pushes upward on employment and upward on prices. I think it is safe to say that relative to historical norms, the current stance of monetary policy is quite unusual. Now, in June of 2011, the FOMC released a statement describing its exit strategy. That is, the sequence of steps involved in returning monetary policy to a more normal stance. But that 2011 statement said nothing about the conditions that would actually trigger the initiation of this sequence of steps, the exit strategy. And this omission is problematic. The current economic impact of both forms of accommodation, low interest rates and asset purchases, depends on what the public believes about when that accommodation will be removed. So to understand this critical point, consider two possible scenarios. In the first, the public believes that the FOMC will initiate liftoff once the unemployment rate hits 7%. In the second, the public believes the FOMC will initiate liftoff when the unemployment rate hits 6%. The higher unemployment rate in the first scenario means that monetary policy will start to be tightened sooner, which will in turn lead to the unemployment rate staying higher for longer. Foreseeing that, people in this first scenario, when the FOMC is tightening at 7%, people will save more in that first scenario than in the second, so as to protect themselves against the higher risks of being unemployed. Because they save more, they spend less, and there is less economic activity. In other words, the FOMC can provide more current stimulus if people believe that liftoff will be triggered by a lower unemployment rate. So with this observation in mind, the remainder of my remarks will describe what I see as an appropriate liftoff plan. The proposed plan is, as you saw earlier in the introduction, as long as the FOMC is continuing to satisfy its price stability mandate, it should keep the Fed funds rate extraordinarily low until the unemployment rate has fallen below 5.5%. As discussed earlier, by satisfy its price stability mandate, I mean that longer-term inflation expectations are stable, and the committee's outlook is that the annual inflation rate in 2 years will be within 1/4 of a percentage point of the target inflation rate of 2%. Why is this liftoff plan a desirable one, or appropriate one? Now, I argued earlier that the FOMC can provide more current stimulus by using a lower unemployment threshold for liftoff. Of course, additional monetary stimulus will give rise to more inflationary pressures. And those pressures are problematic because they could lead the FOMC to violate its price stability mandate. But the committee should choose the lowest unemployment threshold that it sees as unlikely to generate a violation of the price stability mandate. Along those lines, most FOMC participants currently project that a long-run unemployment rate less than 6% will be consistent with 2% inflation. Given these projections and given usual estimates of the impact of the unemployment rate on the medium-term inflation outlook, the outlook for the inflation rate is unlikely to be above 2.25% when the unemployment rate is higher than 5.5%. Hence, over the longer run, an unemployment rate threshold of 5.5% is likely to be consistent with price stability. Now, some observers have suggested that by committing the Fed funds rate, committing to keep the Fed funds rate low until the unemployment rate is as low as 5.5%, the FOMC risks, here I'm trying to paraphrase, getting behind the inflationary curve. As I've discussed, this contingency seems unlikely, given the FOMC's current assessments of the long-run unemployment rate consistent with 2% inflation. In any event, though, this liftoff plan provides an escape clause designed specifically to mitigate this risk, because it says as long as the FOMC satisfies its price stability mandate. The plan allows the FOMC to raise the Fed funds rate if long-term inflation expectations deviate too much from historical norms, or if the medium-term outlook for the inflation rate ever exceeds 2.25%. In this fashion, the plan explicitly maintains price stability as an objective, while also promoting a more robust recovery. It is true that the liftoff plan doesn't say that the committee will raise the Fed funds rate when the medium-term inflation outlook exceeds 2.25%. It only says that it could. The committee's decision in this context would hinge on a delicate cost-benefit calculation that would weigh inflation increases against employment gains. And in my view, that policy conversation should contemplate a reassessment of the long-run unemployment rate that the committee sees as consistent with 2% inflation. In the same vein, the unemployment rate of 5.5% should be viewed as only a threshold to initiate a policy conversation, not a trigger for action. For example, It's possible that macroeconomic shocks could lead the committee's medium-term outlook for inflation to be below 2% when the unemployment rate falls below 5.5%. At that point, the committee might want to defer initiating exit, and the Liftoff plan allows the committee to consider doing just that. I should be clear about how this proposed Liftoff plan generates current stimulus. The basic economics underlying the plan is that if people's expectations about their future prospects improve, they will save less today. As economists are wont to do, I think I can best illustrate this through an extreme example. Suppose that a worker would be given a new contract that contained a no layoff provision. That person would not have to save as much to guard against the possibility of involuntary job loss. That reduced need for saving would translate directly into more spending today. Now, to be clear, was this an example? My proposed Liftoff plan doesn't promise lifetime protection against layoffs to anybody. What it does promise is the FOMC will fully support much higher levels of economic activity. Thus, the plan commits to keeping the Fed funds rate extraordinarily low until the unemployment rate is much nearer historical norms, as long as inflation does remain under control. With that commitment, households can anticipate that unemployment will fall more rapidly, meaning more job security and more jobs available for those who are looking. With that brighter future in store, households will save less and spend more today, and that will drive up economic activity. Now, this plan is distinct from proposals that recommend that the FOMC attempt to stimulate the economy by generating inflation that is well above target. The idea of those proposals is that faced with higher inflation, people will spend more today to avoid the higher future prices. As I've just described, the Liftoff plan in this speech does not operate in that way. Instead, my plan contains price stability as a cornerstone, while still promoting a faster recovery. And I'm highly skeptical about the inflation-based approach given current economic conditions. The FOMC has said that it views the current unemployment rate as being elevated relative to the levels that it sees as being consistent with its mandate to promote maximum employment. With such high unemployment, labor is not scarce. Wage pressures are muted. And that will translate directly into the medium-term outlook for inflation being consistent with price stability. So this reasoning argues that it's difficult for the FOMC to foster above-target inflation given current circumstances, given how high the unemployment rate is. Now, this reasoning was based on an implicit presumption that longer-term inflation expectations remain stable. The FOMC could potentially generate significantly higher inflation in the nearer term by using words and deeds to shift longer-term inflation expectations upward. I would see any such action as being inconsistent with the FOMC's January 2012 statement of longer-run goals that I mentioned earlier. I've spent much of my time today describing what I see as an appropriate Liftoff plan. And I propose that, given current committee thinking about the economy's productive capacity, the committee should plan a deferring exit if the unemployment rate falls below 5.5%. Critically, there are important inflation safeguards embedded in this plan. The committee could consider initiating Liftoff if its medium-term inflation outlook ever exceeds 2.25%. The evidence from the past 15 years suggests that this event is unlikely to occur. Now, I first described the ideas in this speech about 3 weeks ago in Ironwood, Michigan. It evinced mixed reactions. Some observers felt the proposed Liftoff plan was dovish, in the sense that it seemed to put a lot of weight on the employment mandate of the Fed. Others argued that the plan was hawkish, in the sense that it put a lot of weight on the price stability mandate. I think this dispersion of views reflects a simple fact. The plan is neither hawkish nor dovish. The terms hawkish and dovish presume that the committee faces a tension between the two mandates, between price stability and maximum employment. But the committee does not see any such tension now. And its long-run unemployment forecasts suggest that it does not anticipate any tension between the two mandates until the unemployment rate is considerably lower. The Liftoff plan in this speech essentially says that as long as the committee continues to perceive no tension between its two mandates, it should not begin to raise the Fed funds rate. I see this plan as providing an appropriate policy framework, regardless of how the data will evolve over time or how one approaches the two mandates of the FOMC. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to taking your questions.